Yesterday, something happened at sea that looked at first glance like a routine enforcement action. One ship, one stop, one seizure. But in the language of great powers, nothing at sea is ever just about a ship. It's about jurisdiction. It's about deterrence. It's about who gets to write the rules and who has to live under them. According to the public storyline, U.S. authorities seized a Russia-linked oil tanker under their sanctions framework. Within hours, Moscow responded, calling the move illegal and warning it could raise international tensions. And that immediate escalation tells you everything you need to know. This wasn't treated like paperwork. It was treated like a signal. So, what is this really about? Is it simply law enforcement? An action taken because a vessel was allegedly tied to sanction-busting networks? Or is it another front in the widening geopolitical standoff between Washington and Moscow, where legal language becomes a weapon and commercial shipping becomes the battlefield? To answer that, you have to understand something fundamental about modern power. In the 21st century, you don't always need missiles to project force. Sometimes you only need control over systems, finance, insurance, shipping lanes, compliance regimes, and the legal mechanisms that decide what is allowed and what is forbidden. When you control the system, you can pressure an opponent without firing a shot. And the world will often call it rule-based order instead of coercion, depending on which side they're on. That's why this incident matters far beyond the cargo on one tanker. It touches global energy flows, international maritime norms, and the fragile trust that keeps trade moving across oceans every hour of every day. Let's break it down, slowly and neutrally, starting with what we know, then moving to why each side is reacting the way it is and what kind of world this could be building. First, the event itself. The U.S. position, in plain terms, is this: sanctions are not symbolic. If a vessel, company, or network is found bypassing restrictions, moving prohibited cargo, disguising ownership, routing through intermediaries, using shadow logistics, then enforcement is not optional. In that worldview, the seizure isn't an escalation. It's a function of policy. We set the rules, we enforce the rules, otherwise the rules mean nothing. And that logic is powerful because sanctions only work when compliance is feared. If violating sanctions carries no consequences, then sanctions collapse into theater. The entire structure depends on enforcement, visible, credible, and occasionally dramatic. Now, Russia's response. Moscow's argument is also simple, and it hits at a different kind of legitimacy. Russia frames the seizure as unlawful, destabilizing, and dangerous in precedent. The heart of that argument is jurisdiction. The idea that applying one country's domestic laws to seize a foreign-linked vessel, especially in contested contexts at sea, undermines the shared legal fabric global shipping depends on. In that worldview, it's not enforcement. It's extraterritorial power projection dressed up as legality. And this is the collision point. The same action can be described as rule enforcement by one side and illegal coercion by the other. Both narratives can feel coherent inside their own logic. And when two coherent logics collide, diplomacy becomes harder because neither side believes it's the aggressor. This is where we need to zoom out, because the tanker is just the object. The real subject is the system. Sanctions at their core are a way to apply pressure without war. They restrict access to money, markets, technology, shipping services, insurance, ports, banking rails. They are economic constraints enforced through legal threats. And in the modern economy, where everything is connected, the most effective sanctions are the ones that don't only block your target, but also frighten everyone around your target. That's what people mean by secondary effects. You don't even need to punish every violator. You only need to create the risk that any participant in the chain, shippers, insurers, banks, brokers, could be next. Once that fear spreads, private actors start enforcing the policy for you. They avoid the cargo. They refuse the paperwork. They raise premiums. They reroute ships, they drop clients, they overcomply. So if you're Washington, a high-profile seizure is not only about stopping one shipment, it's about reminding the ecosystem, we are watching, we can reach you, and if you test the boundaries, the boundary will test you back. If you're Moscow, that same action is not only about one ship, it's about normalizing a world where your commercial assets can be disrupted in transit, where your trading networks face constant friction, and where the other side can turn compliance into a weapon. Now let's talk about why oil makes this even more sensitive. Oil is never just energy. Oil is revenue. Oil is diplomacy. Oil is strategic influence. Oil is the bloodstream of modern economies, and it moves through vulnerable choke points, ports, straits, shipping lanes, insurers, and payments. That's why tanker incidents can trigger reactions far beyond their physical scale. Because when a tanker is stopped, three things happen almost immediately in the background. First, risk is repriced. Insurers start asking, is this route safe? Is this cargo exposed? Is the ownership structure a liability? If risk rises, premiums rise, and higher premiums become higher transport costs. That can ripple through supply chains and ultimately consumer prices. Second, logistics gets cautious. Shipping companies may avoid certain routes, certain cargoes, certain counterparties. Even if the probability of seizure is small, the consequences are so expensive that companies will often choose avoidance. In the shipping world, predictability is profit. Uncertainty is cost. Third, the narrative spreads. Markets don't only trade barrels of oil, they trade expectations. The perception of disruption can move prices even before physical supply changes. A single incident can create a psychological premium, especially in a world already tense. But there's another layer here, and it's often forgotten, the human layer. When governments clash, it's not presidents and ministers who feel the first pain. It's crews, it's contractors, it's ordinary workers trapped inside geopolitical machinery. That's why Moscow emphasized legal protections and treatment of the crew. Because in these disputes, the crew becomes a symbol, proof of legitimacy, proof of abuse, proof of law. The human dimension turns into part of the messaging war. So is this escalation? Analysts usually split into two interpretations. One interpretation says this is straightforward enforcement. The U.S. has rules. The tanker allegedly violated or enabled violations. Enforcement happened. End of story. The other interpretation says this is strategic signaling, not just enforcement, but a message. Pressure is increasing, and the maritime domain is not off limits. In that framing, the seizure is not a legal endpoint. It's a political statement with legal tools. Here's the crucial insight. Both interpretations can be true at the same time. A state can enforce a law and also enjoy the strategic signal the enforcement creates. In fact, great powers often choose enforcement moments precisely because they serve both purposes at once. And that's what makes this dangerous. When an action is both law and signal, the other side may respond to the signal rather than the law. And signals invite counter-signals. That's how routines become escalations. Now, before we go further, we need to confront the most controversial question in this story: authority at sea. International waters are not a lawless void. They're governed by layered rules: flag state authority, maritime conventions, port state controls, and special frameworks that apply in specific categories like piracy, trafficking, or stateless vessels. But there is no global police force that automatically settles disputes. Enforcement often depends on who has power, who has access, and whose legal systems can reach across borders through finance and trade. So when the U.S. acts, it's not only acting through ships and coast guards, it's acting through the entire compliance ecosystem, the insurers, the banks, the port services, and the legal consequences that follow. Russia challenges that reach, the U.S. defends it, and the rest of the world watches. because what is being tested here is not only U.S.-Russia tension, but the future shape of global maritime governance. In Part 2, we're going to dive into the hard part: how jurisdiction at sea actually works, what international waters really means in practice, where domestic law collides with international norms, and why sanctions enforcement is increasingly pushing the boundaries of what states believe they can do beyond their borders. Because once you understand that legal architecture, you'll see why a single tanker can become a symbol of a much larger struggle, one that isn't going away anytime soon. To understand why this tanker seizure is such a big deal, we need to talk about the part most headlines skip: jurisdiction at sea. Because the real fight here isn't only about oil, it's about authority. Who gets to stop whom, where, and under what legal logic? People hear international waters and assume it means no rules. That's wrong. International waters are full of rules. The problem is that the rules are layered, overlapping, and most importantly, enforced by states, not by a single global police force. So when a powerful state decides to act, the question becomes, is it enforcing a shared rule, or is it exporting its own domestic rules into a space that is supposed to be neutral? That is the legal and geopolitical fault line in this story. Let's break maritime authority down into a few simple pillars. First pillar, the flag state principle. On the high seas, a ship is generally under the jurisdiction of the country whose flag it flies. That flag state is supposed to regulate the ship, inspect it, and enforce compliance. In theory, other states don't just get to jump in and seize a vessel whenever they want. In theory, that would be chaos. But then comes the second pillar: exceptions. International law recognizes certain circumstances where other states can intervene. The classic examples include piracy, slave trade, unauthorized broadcasting, and in some cases trafficking. There are also cases involving stateless vessels, meaning ships that effectively have no valid nationality. Stateless ships don't enjoy the same protections, and that makes them much easier to board and control. Now, here's the key point. Modern sanction enforcement tries to live inside those gray zones, because sanctions are not piracy. They're not universally accepted law. They are political tools passed as domestic regulations or as coordinated policies among allies. Not every country recognizes them. Not every country agrees they should apply globally. So how does a country like the United States enforce sanctions across oceans? Answer: by combining legal reach with system control. There are two main ways this works. 1. Direct legal theory. The U.S. can argue that a vessel is connected to sanction violations, money laundering, fraudulent ownership, or prohibited trade networks that touch the U.S. financial system or U.S. regulated entities. If a network uses dollars, U.S. banks, U.S. insurers, or U.S. services at any point, then Washington often claims it has jurisdiction or enforcement authority. The logic is, if you touch our system, you enter our legal orbit. 2. Indirect system pressure. Even if a ship is far from American shores, it still needs a network: insurance, port access, spare parts, classification services, financing, brokers, and payment processing. If those services are dominated by institutions that fear U.S. penalties, the ship becomes vulnerable. The U.S. doesn't need to own the ocean to control the risk. It only needs to make participation costly for everyone involved. That's why sanctions are so powerful in a globalized world. They weaponize interdependence. Now zoom back to the seizure itself. The controversial part is the idea of stopping and seizing a foreign-linked tanker at sea. That triggers the Russian reaction, because from Moscow's perspective, the U.S. is turning domestic sanctions into a global enforcement regime. Without universal consent, and without a neutral international authority authorizing the action. Russia's fear is not only the immediate loss or disruption, it's the precedent. Because if this becomes normal, If seizures and interdictions become routine, then commercial shipping stops being a neutral space and starts behaving like a contested arena where political alignment determines safety. And that's where the precedent problem becomes massive. Precedent number 1. Normalization of extraterritorial enforcement. If one major power can seize assets linked to an adversary under its domestic rules, another major power can claim the same right under its own rules. That leads to fragmentation, different legal blocks, different enforcement zones, and a more politicized ocean. Precedent number 2. Rising insurance and compliance costs. Shipping depends on predictability. If the rules become politically uncertain, insurers price that uncertainty. Premiums rise. Contracts get stricter. Companies demand more documentation. Routes get longer. All of that increases the cost of global trade. Precedent number 3. Incentive for shadow shipping to evolve. When pressure increases, the networks don't disappear. They adapt. More complex ownership structures, more flag changes, more intermediaries, more secrecy. That creates a cat-and-mouse dynamic, where enforcement becomes more aggressive and evasion becomes more sophisticated. And that brings us to a crucial modern factor: technology. Shipping today is not invisible. Vessel movements are tracked by satellites, AIS transponders, commercial intelligence firms, and data analytics. Cargo patterns can be inferred. Port calls are logged. Ownership networks can be mapped. This makes enforcement more feasible than in the past. But it also makes everything more contested, because every action is recorded and debated in public. The moment a state boards a ship, the story isn't just in courtrooms. It's in global media, social platforms, and diplomatic briefings. Legitimacy becomes part of the battle. So now we're in a world where enforcement is not only about legality, it's also about narrative control. And that leads to the next layer: why both sides are framing this so aggressively. The U.S. narrative emphasizes rule enforcement. It wants allies, markets, and compliance actors to believe the system is consistent. Sanctions are real, violations have consequences, and order is being maintained. The Russian narrative emphasizes sovereignty and fairness. It wants partners and neutral states to see the U.S. as overreaching, applying domestic rules beyond borders, threatening maritime neutrality, and turning trade into coercion. Because in great power competition, legitimacy is currency. If you can convince third parties that your interpretation is the legal one, you gain room to act. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. International law often has gaps, and powerful states fill gaps with power. There is no single, universally accepted enforcement authority at sea for sanctioned regimes. So what matters is who can operationalize enforcement: through fleets, through alliances, through financial control, and through compliance fear. That's why this incident is so revealing. It shows how law and power overlap. Law gives actions a framework. Power gives them consequences. And when the law is disputed, the consequences become the reality. So what happens next? There are 3 likely pathways, and each one has different implications. Path 1. Quiet diplomacy. Publicly, both sides stay firm. Privately, they negotiate to keep the situation from spiraling. This is common. Governments often perform toughness for domestic and international audiences while using back channels to prevent escalation. Path 2. Legal escalation. Russia could push for legal challenges, diplomatic protests, and arguments in maritime or international frameworks. Even if the process is slow, the goal is not only a legal verdict, it's to shape global perception and limit future U.S. actions. Path 3. Tighter enforcement and counter-enforcement. The U.S. may treat the seizure as proof of policy strength and step up monitoring. Russia, in response, may harden its own posture through new routes, new partners, or even retaliatory measures that raise costs for Western shipping interests. And this is where the risk grows. Retaliatory cycles don't need to be symmetrical. They only need to raise friction. In Part 3, we'll bring everything together: the energy market consequences, the global trade spillover, the role of allies and neutral states, and the most important question: whether this is an isolated enforcement action or a sign that maritime space is becoming another permanent theater of great power confrontation. Because if the ocean becomes politicized, the world gets more expensive, more volatile, and more unstable, whether you live in Washington, Moscow, or anywhere else. Now we get to the part that really matters for everyone outside Washington and Moscow: consequences. Because this isn't just a diplomatic argument about who's right. It's a stress test for the systems that keep the world running: energy flows, shipping reliability, insurance pricing, trade predictability, and investor confidence. When a major power stops a tanker and the other major power calls it illegal, the immediate question is not only what happened, but what does this normalize? Because markets and supply chains don't run on speeches. They run on expectations. And expectations change fast when power starts moving at sea. Let's start with energy. Oil markets are not only about supply and demand in a physical sense, they're about risk, timing, and confidence. Even a single incident can create a risk premium if it suggests a broader pattern: more interdictions, more enforcement, more friction. Here's how that spills over. First, risk repricing in shipping and insurance. The moment enforcement becomes more visible, insurers and shipping firms adjust. They ask, is this route exposed? Is this cargo politically sensitive? Are these counterparties clean? If the answer is maybe, the price of doing business goes up. That doesn't always show up as a dramatic spike in oil prices overnight. Often it shows up as creeping costs: higher premiums, more compliance checks, longer routing, more paperwork, more delays. But those creeping costs accumulate, and they are passed on through freight rates, through refined product prices, through the cost of everything transported by sea. Second, changes in trade behavior. When enforcement tightens, companies and states adapt. Some will avoid certain cargo types. Some will shift to alternative suppliers. Some will use different intermediaries. Some will reroute through ports and jurisdictions perceived as safer. This creates inefficiency. The world becomes less optimized, less direct, more expensive. And when the global economy becomes less efficient, growth slows at the margins, and inflation pressure can rise at the margins, especially in import-dependent regions. Third, the strategic message to third countries. A lot of countries don't want to choose sides between the U.S. and Russia. They want oil. They want stability. They want trade without getting dragged into conflict. But events like this force quiet recalculations. If you're a country that buys energy and wants to avoid political risk, you might ask, do we need more diversified supply? Do we need different payment rails? Do we need to reduce exposure to sanctions risk? Do we need alternative insurers or shipping partners? Even if they don't say it publicly, they will think it privately. And when enough actors think that way, the global system slowly bends. Now let's talk about the deeper issue: the politicization of neutral commercial space. For decades, global shipping has depended on a basic assumption: the ocean is commercial space governed by broadly shared rules. Sure, there were wars, blockades, and exceptions, but the baseline was predictability. What happens when predictability erodes? You get a world where commercial assets become bargaining chips, where compliance becomes a weapon, where ships and crews become exposed to geopolitical punishment, where neutral business becomes harder to maintain. And that's where escalation risk becomes real, even without direct military conflict. Because escalation today doesn't always mean missiles. It can mean more seizures, more inspections, more detentions, more shadow networks, more retaliatory legal actions, more pressure on ports and insurers, more accidents and ambiguous incidents that no one claims responsibility for. That's how confrontation becomes normalized. This leads to an important concept: normalization of confrontation. When something happens once, it's exceptional. When it happens repeatedly, it becomes a pattern. When it becomes a pattern, the world adapts around it, sometimes in ways that make things worse. Some experts will argue strong enforcement maintains order. Others will argue overuse of enforcement erodes the system itself. Both arguments have logic. If rules are violated with zero consequences, the rules collapse. But if enforcement is perceived as selective, political, or extraterritorial overreach, trust collapses. So the real challenge is balance. How do you enforce without turning the entire system into a battlefield? Now bring in the information war, because it matters more than most people think. In modern geopolitics, narratives are part of deterrence. For the United States, enforcing sanctions sends a deterrence message. We can reach you. We can disrupt you. The system is not optional. For Russia, rejecting the seizure publicly sends a different deterrence message. We won't accept this as legitimate. We will resist. Pressure will not go unanswered. And when both sides are signaling deterrence, every move becomes more loaded. That's why this incident feels bigger than one tanker, because it fits into a longer historical pattern. Great power rivalry often expands first through economic tools before it expands through direct conflict. Trade restrictions, resource control, financial pressure, legal warfare. These are classic instruments of competition, just modernized with data, satellites, and global finance. So is this a turning point? Not necessarily a single turning point, more like a symptom of a system under strain. The world is still deeply interconnected. Oil still moves across oceans. Trade still depends on shared procedures. But political trust is weaker than before, and major powers increasingly test the boundaries of the system when it suits their interests. That tension between interdependence and rivalry is the defining feature of this era. Now here's the final question. What could happen next? There are 4 realistic outcomes ranging from mild to serious. Outcome 1. The incident fades, but the lesson remains. Quiet diplomacy reduces the temperature. The specific case ends, but the precedent sits in the background and shapes future behavior. Outcome 2. Legal and diplomatic friction becomes ongoing. More protests, more disputes, more public statements, more uncertainty, without immediate escalation, but with long-term erosion of trust. Outcome 3. Tighter enforcement becomes routine. More monitoring, more interdictions, more compliance pressure, making global shipping more expensive and more politicized. Outcome 4. Tit for tat begins. Not necessarily the same action in reverse, but a cycle of pressure responses that increases friction across multiple domains: maritime, financial, cyber, diplomatic. And the risk here is not one dramatic event. The risk is cumulative instability, because cumulative instability is how systems break. Conclusion: this was never just about one tanker. For the United States, it's framed as legal enforcement, proof that sanctions are real and violations have consequences. For Russia, it's framed as unlawful pressure, proof that the U.S. is extending domestic power beyond borders and undermining maritime norms. For the rest of the world, it's a reminder that when superpowers collide, the shockwaves spread into energy prices, shipping costs, trade reliability, and economic confidence. The real outcome won't be decided in one day or one statement. It will be shaped by how markets reprice risk, how insurers and shippers adjust behavior, how third countries quietly reposition, and whether diplomacy can prevent enforcement actions from turning into permanent confrontation. And that's the bigger point. In a world of rising competition, even a single ship can become a symbol of authority, of influence, and of where global order is heading next. So how do you see it? Was this simply a legal action, an enforcement move that any state would take to protect its sanctions policy? Or does it signal something deeper, a shift toward a more politicized ocean where trade routes are becoming another arena of power rivalry? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. If you found this breakdown useful, like the video and subscribe for more fact-based neutral analysis.